Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to this FS Club webinar out of London. Today, we're going to be addressing data privacy, managing the risk of future liability, and I'm really delighted to have three guests with us today, Matthew, Hazel, and Kevin, respectively from Alvarez and Marsal, and Hazel's from Field Fisher. So it's going to be a fun and interesting session. You'll all know me. I'm Michael Mainelli. I'm one of the directors of Zien. And it really is my privilege and pleasure to be able to introduce these events. And the only reason I can do so is because of the generosity and, may I say, tolerance of our sponsors. Tolerance, an often underrated word, but they allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And of course, today is right at the heart of it. We're going to be looking at this whole issue of data privacy, which drives most of technology and most of finance today, with particularly interesting announcements recently by social media groups that they seem to be moving from being utilities into perhaps the world of publishing. So a lot going on here. Anyway, my job is to get out of the way and let you hear from our experts, and I'll do so in just a moment. A reminder that the format today is very much, once my introduction is finished, I'll be handing over initially to Matthew, who will then hand on to Hazel, then hand on to Kevin. As ever, no introductions. The details are on the website for all of them. Get into the heart of the matter. Very finally, we've reserved about 15, maybe even 20 minutes for Q&A. I'll be feeding those questions into a discussion with our three experts, but may I ask you to please use the GoToWebinar question facility. No point in sending me an email or a text. I'm here with you, and I'll get those afterwards, but if you want to feature them, please do get them in. And we've got a fairly large audience today, so please do send your questions, comments, observations in early so that Matthew, Hazel, and Kevin have a chance to answer them. So with no further ado, I'm going to turn over to our three guests, and I believe, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Michael, and good morning, everyone. So, I'm Matt Negus. I'm a Senior Director in Alvarez & Marsal's Privacy and Data Compliance Services practice. I've been working in this field now for over 16 years, having started my career at the Information Commissioner's Office, and I've actually held roles at Insurance Services, Deloitte, Bank of New York Mellon, and Promontory. Alvarez & Marsal is a global professional services firm which has made its name in turnaround management and performance improvement, working with many large high-profile businesses, operates across the world and specializes in supporting clients in turnaround and restructuring, tax advisory, performance improvement, regulatory and risk advisory, transaction and private equity, and disputes and investigations. I think what we're going to do first of all is just start with a quick poll. And what we'll
great. Yep. So, folks, being asked basically, has your organization been involved in any corporate transaction activity, mergers, acquisitions, divestments in the last 12 months? Just launched the poll, so it's pretty straightforward. Yes, no, I don't know. We're always impressed here, I guess, with the speed. Over 60% have voted already of the audience. I'll close the poll in just a moment as we get the numbers on up to the 90% mark. Fantastic. I'm closing the poll now, and I'll share the results. Well, sadly for people in the M&A world, nearly 70% haven't done anything in the last 12 months, I hasten to add. Is that all right then, Matthew? You said?
Yeah, no, that's great. Thanks, Michael. I think it also actually highlights that sometimes these matters can also be quite confidential and sensitive, and can sometimes not be very widely known within the organisation. So, yeah, in any case, I guess this slide is really just intended to give a bit of a picture of, I guess, the complexity of data protection and privacy matters in corporate transactions. And really, this is just intended to highlight the varying visibility of some of the challenges that we see in this space. So typically in our experience, some of the most visible risks in a corporate transaction with respect to privacy and cyber issues typically are those which are most visible, and that those usually are policies, procedures, any regulatory declarations, but also things like, let's say, privacy notices, which may be, more visible sections such as data collection channels, such as, let's say, websites, for example. As we sort of go down the iceberg image, we'll see that some of the issues then become a little bit less visible or almost hidden to some extent. And I guess one of the other important points here is the governance structure within the organization. That is also a good indicator of the potential risks that may be lurking beneath. And particularly, what we're saying here is really the extent of privacy resourcing within the organization. So does the organization even have a privacy function? How many employees are there within that function? Or is it the fact that there isn't even a standalone function and you actually have someone, let's say, I don't know, maybe in the legal department or in technology who's essentially doing this off the side of the desk? So that sometimes can be a bit of a warning sign in some cases. Another issue that tends to be quite complex in these areas is cross-border data transfers. I'm not going to talk, you probably got to know about the Schrems II ruling, but that has highlighted the increasing complexities around cross-border data transfers within organizations. And that can be cross-border data transfers on an intra-company basis within the corporate group, but also sharing of personal data and cross-border transfers amongst the supply chain and third-party network of suppliers. Other issues here that can be, again, as we get deeper into the organization, again, provide more risk here and potential ramifications for organizations to think about here. And this is, again, the supply chain and the vendor relationships that the organization may already have. In a lot of cases, these are going to be driven by the size and structure of the organization. But a key thing here is to also look at the materiality of some of the third-party service providers, and also the extent to which, let's say, any subcontractors that may be used. And again, another challenge here can be the speed or the availability of which some of these vendor relationships are actually relationships, but actually the contractual agreements are available, because that can also create some risks in this space. And finally, I won't steal Hazel's thunder, because she's going to talk about some of the issues that have happened and publicly in this space. But one of the things that can be also a bit of an issue in this regard is with respect to legacy data sets, particularly with systems that may have been in use for a long period of time, may not have been subject to the same level of, let's say, rigor and control as may be necessary, and also may be housing data sets that have been subject to, let's say, over retention as well. So quite a number of complex issues here. And again, these can be difficult to dig out and identify, again, when you're having to undertake due diligence at pace, and within, constrictions of the timelines of any deal. But these are some of the risk areas to look out for. And with that, I will now pass over to Hazel.
Thanks very much, Matt. And hello, everyone. My name is Hazel Grant. I'm the head of privacy at Field Fisher. For those of you who don't know us, we are a European law firm with offices across Europe, the UK, US, and China. And I have a team in the UK of over 25 lawyers who spend their entire time advising on data protection, which is a thing of a mystery to me, how we can find so much work to do, but there it is. Especially since about 20 odd years ago when I started advising on data protection, it was about that much of my practice. Anyway, I have 3 points that I want to make to you, and you will be surprised to hear a number of these are actually negative points, but I'm just going to make you wait for a moment and say there's one more poll I think we need to do right now, Michael, before we move on to my points.
How would you rate the importance of privacy and cyber risk issues in the context of a corporate transaction? I'm just launching the poll now. And I must say I haven't done a corporate transaction in the last 12 months, but I have done them in the past, and I typically really didn't give this much thought, and that's I think why it's very important today that we're covering this subject. As ever, in under 10 seconds, over 50% of our audience has voted, so they're really wide awake here. I'm going to close the poll in just another 4 or 5 seconds. And we're now well over the 80% mark. I'm closing the poll now, and I'll share the results. And you can see that the audience is much smarter than I am, very much high, 57%, and 37% at moderate high, and really nothing below that. So a fantastic commendation on the careful way that our audience tries to avoid your negatives, Hazel.
Excellent. I mean, I feel now that I'm preaching to the converted. This is fantastic news. So from a personal perspective, I think I can probably say that data privacy and due diligence really hasn't come to the fore until probably, I don't know, GDPR time, so 2018 onwards, which is a bit shocking, really, but it is true. And the other thing that maybe won't surprise a number of the audience is that unfortunately data protection law doesn't really have a great deal to say specifically about due diligence. So we kind of have to muddle our way through about how we will deal with corporate transactions. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But I really have 3 points to make. And as I said before, a couple of them are negative. You know what lawyers are like. So the first one is, I would say, and this might be a bit of a surprise to you, I don't think that privacy legal issues or data privacy legal issues will scupper a deal. Normally, you will find that they are significant and they really shouldn't be ignored, but they won't stop a deal. Now, there will always be examples where they could stop a deal. If you have something that is a major merger between really significant players in a market, there might be competition law issues about the fact that they will be merging lists of subscribers or users of a platform, for example. But for the vast majority of businesses, data is important, but it won't be the death of a deal. The reason why I think it is important is that it will affect things like potentially the price that you're going to pay for the business. Certainly, it'll play into the drafting of the agreement, the purchase agreement, the investment agreement, whatever. And more significantly, and something that I think a lot of purchasers don't think about, is it will affect the integration that you're planning post-closing. Because you really need to think about what you're buying to know how quickly you can integrate it into the rest of your business. So that's my first negative. My second negative, and again, I'm probably doing myself out of a job here, is to say that realistically, the agreement that you sign for the purchase, the warranties, the disclosure letter, etc., that won't protect you against all the horrible things that could happen to you and come up to the surface post the purchase. Now, why do I say that? I say that because what that agreement will give you is some protection and some compensation from the seller, you would hope, if you can fulfill all the ifs and buts that are in the agreement in order to get that compensation. But it won't stop a regulator bringing a claim against you for a breach. It won't stop complaints from individuals, from users or employees, and it won't stop data activists who maybe are sharpening their knives and want to have a go at you. So that's another reason why I think you need to be forewarned is forearmed before you buy into a business. Now, there's a very visible example of this. We've got the headline there, Marriott faces a $100 million fine over the Starwood data breach. You know, for those of you who haven't spent an enjoyable morning reading the ICO's fine penalty notice on this. It's, I don't know, about 100 pages long, and it covers how they got to the point where they were thinking of fining 99 million, but eventually, quotes, only fined 18.4 million to Marriott. Marriott had purchased Starwood, had carried out some form of due diligence, but had not remedied the issues that existed in the Starwood system. So as Matt was saying earlier on, they inherited some legacy problems, and the ICO came after them for it because they had not remedied those issues. So there's a situation where I'm sure Marriott have got a fantastic agreement with the sellers of Starwood, but Marriott had to face the music with the ICO. And so my last point is less negative and more, what can you actually do about it? As I mentioned at the outset, unfortunately, data privacy law doesn't really give us a clear set of rules on how to deal with due diligence. You can't go to a section of the GDPR or the DPA in the UK to say, this is the section on corporate deals. You need to think about certain things. So, for example, you will probably be sharing information prior to the deal going through. If you are sharing things like lists of employees or lists of customers, then ideally you want to do that in an anonymous fashion so that you don't trigger data protection issues. That's not always possible. For example, if you only have one managing director, it's going to be pretty obvious who that person is. When you do share information, you need to do it securely. And I know Kevin will be speaking to us about some of the issues that exist with cyber risks in deals. You also have to think about the deal structure. If you have a share transaction, if you're buying the shares in the target, then the data controller stays the same. It is the same legal entity. That makes it much easier for you. But you will uncover issues later on when you want to merge that target into your group. There will be a change in the legal entity. You will also find that there are issues, for example, should you be doing a business sale where there will be a change in the legal entity. So in those situations, you need to look at some of the points that Matt was talking about earlier on. You have to look at revising things like privacy notices. Potentially, you have to go out to individuals and give them an opportunity to reject the fact that you will be the new purchaser and running the business. I think a lot of what this teaches me is, and I hope teaches people who are buying businesses, is the time spent on due diligence is important, not to put you off making the purchase, but to get you ready for what you have to do post-purchase. And if you are looking to sell a business or take investment, I think the other thing it teaches you is it's a good idea and it's wise investment to spend the time on getting your house in order before you actually go to the market, because it will smooth out the process greatly. So I think that's all I really wanted to cover in my section. I think I'm now handing over to Kevin.
Thank you, Hazel. I thought I was supposed to be the fearmonger.
Certainly not.
No, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. My name is Kevin Hull. I'm a senior director at Alvarez & Marsal, and I work in the cyber risk services practice, and we cover the EMEA, even though we're a global practice. We're on this side of the pond. And before I comment on some of Hazel's and Matt's comments, do we want to do the last poll, Michael?
Yes, we can certainly do that. Give me just a split second here. I'll just launch that poll now.
Thank you.
So the poll, is cybersecurity and data privacy represented in your corporate transaction risk management settings? So always, sometimes, never, don't know, and NA. And we'll have quite a few NAs here, given the earlier question, although this is more than just the last year. So feel free, folks. Again, we're well over the 50% mark have voted. I'll just be closing the poll there. And if you look at it from the perspective of those who, with a large portion, aren't actively doing transactions, quite solidly, yes, it's very much involved there, Kevin.
That's good. All right, cool. Thank you.
Okay.
So to follow on with one of Hazel's comments about cyber and data privacy being kind of an afterthought or not always inclusive. There are also some common misunderstandings that go along with this. And the first one that I commonly come across is that cyber and data privacy are an IT function, and that they should be taken care of in the IT due diligence. And so we commonly argue against this point because it's more than an IT function. And I think you can see from the representation on the panel that there's more to it than just that. And that also includes the accountability that's now a focus of regulations on top management. So not including cyber and data privacy in your due diligence, it definitely places an unnecessary risk on your investments. Hazel talked about the Marriott breach. There's also Spirit Aerosystems, who acquired ASCO for quite a deal of $420 million US after reductions of $180 million due to continuing fallout from a cyber attack in the previous year. So we can see that there's definitely, it might not be a deal breaker. We're commonly asked, are these deal breakers? Are there these issues are going to stop us from acquiring this business? And what we really need to do when we're focusing on the transactions is to explain what the risks are to the acquirer or to the major shareholder, so they can understand how to deal with this and rectify it and get the company into a better position. We talk a lot about, or I talk a lot about, cyber attacks. And why do the cyber attacks or data breaches happen? And usually we point to human error or exploitation. But a more topical reason is poorly designed, governed cybersecurity and data privacy programs, including poorly scoped and implemented technologies. A bit of a funny story to go along with that is I was the interim CISO. I was engaged as an interim CISO 6 months before the GDPR became applicable. And on the second day of being in the office, obviously, on the second day of being in the office, I was asked by the CFO if I knew anything about the GDPR. And I knew it was a loaded question, but I answered honestly. And from that point forward, I was responsible for developing our program, which they hadn't even really thought about. So what's the relevance of this story? Well, my client was a revenue-driven culture, or had created a revenue-driven culture that grew entirely through M&A, and security and data privacy were complete afterthoughts. And the consequence of this combination is that when they acquired or merged with a company, they were opening up their infrastructure to other companies without understanding how they govern their security and data privacy. And they were also increasing the risk of introducing sickness into their infrastructure, which obviously can result in a data breach or a disruptive attack. So the loaded question is, how do you know if you're targeting or being targeted by a company with poorly governed security programs and data privacy programs? Most companies will talk about, when you go into the deal, we'll talk about how they align their cyber programs to security control frameworks like NIST or ISO 27001 or CIS 20, and that's a great thing. Companies should look to apply frameworks to help them develop and govern their programs. But what a lot of companies do is they pick a program and they look to introduce it without identifying and understanding the risks to business objectives and the critical information and processes used to achieve these. And I do include back office data and processes in this, so we have HR, we have accounts payable, we have finance, we have legal, and also depending on your industry, your risk appetite around data privacy will obviously change, like a strictly B2B industrial products distributor versus a multi-jurisdiction dental care company. But the principle is the same: know your objectives, know your critical data, know your critical processes. Why is understanding risk versus introducing a blanket security framework approach bad or not ideal? Is because when you implement a security controls framework without taking a risk-based approach, you're essentially throwing a king-size blanket over a twin-size bed, right? So in many cases, security is applied across all information and processes equally, which means we're not focusing on protecting our critical objectives. And financially speaking, this also usually leads to a disproportionate investment in the security program and technology used. What does a healthy target will have identified their assets, including the important information, processes, and assets, will have performed a potential impact assessment, which means identifying the financial, reputational, and compliance impact in the event of CIA, a loss of CIA, so that's confidentiality, integrity, and availability. They will assess their threat likelihood of an attack against the company and the assets processing that important information. They will have defined their controls framework based on the results of the impact and their assessment. And after comparing the above discussed points, they'll compare that to their defined risk appetite that they've developed, and then which results in activities, organizational, process, technical, to mitigate the cyber risk for information that's critical to the business and according to the company risk appetite, and help them develop a detailed multi-year plan prioritized by risk. So we have a lot of things that we can do that look good on paper in a transaction, so one of the deals I'm working on now, the client is multi-jurisdiction, and they have 5 or 6 different data protection authorities and regulations that they're trying to look at and understand whether or not the company is governed properly. And Hazel and Matt will also say, look, if you don't know what your objectives are and where your data is, and you don't really know how you've thrown your nets to cover your regulations, then you're introducing potential gaps or vulnerabilities into that system. So when you acquire it, you could lose a tremendous amount of value after the deal if you're not covered by warranties and things like this that Hazel's touched on. So that's me, Michael. As far as covering this, I'm definitely open for questions, and I'm sure Hazel and Matt are as well.
Well, that's fantastic. Thank you very, very much, Matthew, Hazel, and Kevin. And we do have quite a few questions here. So folks, as mentioned, please do send your questions in. A question from Chris Smith, and he's asked, he's directed to you, Kevin. What are your thoughts on virtual data rooms best practice in relation to multi-party access and revocation during an M&A transaction?
It's a good question, and I think Hazel touched on it a bit when sharing data and understanding what data we're going to be sharing with entities outside. From a security standpoint, we obviously have to know who we're sharing this data with. I know there's things that we can do, like assigning privileges to specific folders and understanding who's accessing that data and what data is contained within there. I'm sure Matt would talk about understanding the things that need to be done and to comply with regulation before putting that data into an exposed area. And by exposed, even though it's protected, it's still open to others. Then you can also control what data is downloaded, how it's viewed. You got to know the jurisdictions that people are going to be in. So it's a necessity, but there are controls that need to be put in place around that to understand how we're ensuring that data is not going to be leaked or put out or spread to people that shouldn't have it.
Hazel, Bob McDowell.
Can I just jump in there and just say, I don't know, Matt, whether you were going to add something as well, but to what Kevin was saying, obviously as a lawyer, I would love to plaster an agreement all over this data room. So I suspect that most businesses will probably be more concerned about the confidential information that's in there than any personal data, because you would try to minimize personal data in that data room for the reasons I said before, because the law doesn't really give you a good way to share personal data like this. You're meant to be telling individuals if you're sharing their personal data you won't want to tell all the employees and all your customers that you might be about to share their personal data. So I think the bigger issue that most businesses will be looking at is the fact that the data room will contain some confidential business information. So obviously you're going to have a confidentiality agreement before anybody goes anywhere near that. Matt, is there anything else that you would add to that?
No, I mean, I think you've both covered it really well. I think obviously it should go without saying, but obviously minimizing the number of people who are provisioned with access to the data room, and trying to time limit it where necessary as well, I think is obviously, good practice.
And Michael, just on top of that, just as a follow-on, the VDRs aren't your only exposure, because we all know that we sit on these video conference calls and presentations that go over all the information that's discussed. And there are controls that should be considered on how you govern people accessing that environment as well. Because I've sat on calls and you see people are not putting names in and telephone numbers are popping up, and then the host, there's no one in control of understanding who those people are. So we need to know who's supposed to be accessing, the number of people, how they're going to access, and then the privileges around whether or not they can take snapshots of the data or download the data and that sort of thing. So,
okay, Hazel, a question to you from Ian Sheridan concerning the cost of avoiding fines. When assessing Marriott and other cases, what have been the typical costs that would have prevented the breach? For example, in Marriott, the fine, as you say, was 18.4 million. How much do you estimate the extra due diligence might have cost?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, I think to have a genuine cost of avoiding that 18.4 million fine, it wouldn't just be the due diligence, because it would also be the remediation work that would have had to have been put into the security of the Starwood element of the business. And costs of due diligence, I mean, how long is a piece of string? We have some clients who come to us at kind of like the last minute and say, will you do a bit of due diligence on data privacy issues and don't spend more than £1,000 or something? You can't do anything for that. I think that it would be nowhere near 18.4 million, without a doubt. It would have been probably, to do proper due diligence, I'm guessing, under 100,000 to do proper due diligence to include both privacy and cyber work. And you do get some sort of automated systems that can kind of crawl over what you've got to give you a picture of the data that is being accessed and used by a target. So that's a possibility. But I do think any cost of due diligence would have to be added to the remediation work that would have been needed. And there, I'm afraid I would be in the hands of Kevin and Matt to give an estimate for that.
There's a supplementary here from Ian in West London, which Kevin and Matt, you might have some thoughts on. What roughly do you think is available in the insurance market to cover some of these risks post-transaction?
Matt, did you want to take this?
No, Kevin, it's more your bailiwick, so go for it.
I mean, I think there's even did we put a slide in here on cyber insurance? I don't remember, but I mean, look, we always want to protect our investments and understand, as I mentioned, the risks in there. I mean, one of the clients I have is an insurer, and we spend an awful lot of time when companies are looking to gain cyber insurance, looking at cyber security programs, risk, and data privacy risk to help them determine the value of the bind. So I'm understanding the question correctly. I mean, cyber insurance and insurances around the post-deal insurances are always things that you're going to want to look at obtaining when you have a higher risk entity that you're looking to acquire.
I suppose the one thing to add on the cyber insurance is it can assist with the costs associated with the response to the breach and perhaps some of the remediation activities, but it won't, from a public policy perspective, it's not going to cover you for the actual monetary penalties that you may incur if you're unfortunate enough to be, on the receiving end of an ICO monetary penalty or whatnot.
By the way, on the previous question, Ian Sheridan's kicked back. His estimate is that the cost of the additional due diligence would be less than 2% of the fine, but I'll leave it at that. A question from Bob McDowell, is a lawyer in the Channel Islands, possibly directed mostly to you, Hazel. Is there a case that some data should not be held in electronic form, but in hard copy form only, perhaps shared in the deal room only in printed format?
Interesting suggestion. I think that I'd question whether that was worth it, because I think that the way that everybody operates these days is that they expect to have soft copy digital data, and to end up with something that is a paper copy. I mean, we all know that paper copies can go amiss anyway. That's the basis of a large number of the fines that were levied against the NHS was related to paper copies of documents being left in the wrong place, or being stolen, or faxes being sent to the wrong place. So I think it's an interesting question, and it's an interesting point. I suspect that for the majority of deals, it would just raise too many problems, too many practical problems.
Okay. Bob also has a question on, to what extent is the media exempt from data privacy regulations in the context of corporate transactions?
I'm wondering now, I'm assuming Bob is saying in terms of making comment about corporate transactions. Well, obviously the media has some exemptions under GDPR, so it has a journalistic exemption, so it's able to publish information. And there is actually some debate about, how far that exemption goes. Does it go to citizen journalists who are out there videoing something that's happening? I think in terms of data protection and corporate transactions, that's probably quite limited, in that most of the information that is being published by a journalist is actually about the corporate entity that's being sold, rather than, specific references to the fact that Hazel Grant is a customer of this business that is about to be sold. So I suspect that although they do have exemptions, they're probably not terribly relevant. And obviously, they will still be governed by things like the control of information, which happens to be market sensitive or price sensitive information. So there's still some limits over what they can publish in terms of upcoming significant deals.
Simon Lupa has a question, I think, directed to Kevin and Matthew. How close is the correlation between the assessed severity of regulatory risk to business risk?
How close are they? I would say extremely close. I mean, they're consequences. It's cause and effect, really. So business risk, we can control, and regulatory risk we can control, but you have to start with the business risk before you move out. You need to know the regulations that you're playing in, but you also need to know the business objectives and the assets that you have and that you survive on, in order to keep your business running and established. But then also you want to define how what needs to go to the regulators and what needs to be protected from a fine standard point of view, and also a reputational standard point of view.
I think in a related way, is there an area where somebody undertaking a transaction might find themselves doing a tremendous amount of work for regulatory purposes that they just don't see the business case for it?
Well, it's like and Hazel and Matt might think otherwise, but what we come across a lot of times is people just trying to accomplish tick box exercises, which is never really the answer. I mean, it is an answer because they're trying to protect themselves from regulatory risk, but it's not the answer. And this is going into what I was saying earlier about the DD I'm working on, where we have 5 or 6 different regulators around data privacy because of jurisdiction, and nobody knows where the gaps are, where the overlap is, and where the gaps are in that. And so we've exposed ourselves from all different angles.
Yeah. Can I just jump in there, Mike? Oh, sorry, Matt, you go ahead.
No, it's okay. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think just to add to Kevin's point, I guess two things is going to be, I guess, first of all, the volume of data that the organization holds and processes is going to be tied to this to some extent. So, an organization operating, I don't know, in let's say the data economy space, such as technology or financial services, in the retail banking space, is going to have far more sensitive personal data, let's say, than organizations in the B2B space, for example. So there's likely to be a greater regulatory risk there if things go wrong or awry in some way. I guess the other thing would be the nature of the industry sector as well that the organization is operating in. So again, financial services and pharmaceuticals, for example, tend to be heavily regulated sectors anyway. And then in the technology space, you actually have a lot of media interest anyway at the moment around, particularly what they call the FANGs or the FANGAM companies are doing. So I think the risk exposure and the risk landscape here is quite dynamic as well.
Hazel, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that it is very difficult to do this sort of cost analysis because I think the other thing that you would or should take account of is the amount of management time that has to be spent in dealing with regulators. And I am working with a business that was subject to an audit from a regulator and it's probably taken them well over a year to get through this. And the amount of management time, senior management time, to try and navigate the issues that have come out of that. How do you price that? That's a huge amount of time that those managers could have been spending on developing new services and doing something else, instead of which they've been trying to navigate around these complaints and try and mitigate them. So that's a difficult thing to price in, but it is a cost.
And time is precious. As we're coming to the end, I've got time to just squeeze in one that maybe all three of you might want to quickly comment upon. It's a bit of a long one too. It's from Craig Kersey. What observations do you have regarding data transfers arising from the activities of firms or staff, which can give rise to retention of personal data in a manner which may bypass the usual procedures? So by way of example, many organizations, probably including your own firms, would host events for professional bodies. Staff may help organize events for and contribute to the management of professional bodies, all of which can involve receipt of sensitive personal data and its storage on machines which are the responsibility of the host firm. So how should one manage the related privacy and data protection issues?
Wow, that is a tricky one. I mean, the stock answer would be that you train people and you have policies and procedures which control where the data flows. The thing is that we're dealing with humans. So, and humans are very, very clever at getting around those sorts of things. So I think you have to go with the stock answer. You have training, you have policies and procedures, but you also need some technology to control where this data is going, so that you know that if, for example, a list of members of this organization has been transferred by me to Kevin at his Hotmail account, there is some traceability of that transfer. Because inevitably, people people very rarely try and do something deliberately to cause a problem, but they'll do it accidentally or there'll be a breach.
Yeah, and just on
sorry, Michael. I guess one thing I was just going to add is I guess the importance of a clear privacy notice. When you're accepting registration for participants, privacy notice is basically a case of saying what you do and doing what you say, really. So I think having something there just to be transparent about what you're doing with the data is going to hold you in good stead there.
Yeah. And my last note will be quick. You have an objective, you have processes, you have information, you have technology that's going to be used. Then you have to understand the risk of the compromise from the CIA point of view, as I mentioned before. And then you define your security controls around that. and so based off of your risk appetite. So it's an easy formula. It's easier said than done. It's a formula that's proven to work, and you should always consider that when you're taking on any sort of new process, objective, or whatever that's going to deal with transferring data, especially sensitive data, into other jurisdictions.
Great. Well, I'm afraid we have not just hit time, but gone slightly over, but I think it was well worth it. What I take away from this is a great appreciation of what you've shown a spotlight on an area that I don't think people think about very often. GDPR, data privacy, these are things that happen in the organization, but when two organizations merge, or three, or whatever, that's when this really starts to come up very sharply. And it's interesting to see that we've got real experts in that space, which is very, very helpful. I've got 3 quick rounds of thanks, so just hold on as I come back to you. But first, I must, as ever, thank our sponsors. Most of them are involved in technology or finance or economic areas, all of which are related very clearly to this issue of data protection and privacy and GDPR during transactions. I'd also like to thank the audience. Appreciate many of your questions and comments. We could have gone on. A lot of people, funnily enough, wanted to pick up on the discussion that we had during the warm-up amongst the 4 of us. But really, regulators have been historically reluctant to go after social media in respect of data privacy, but with the emerging news. But I think that's a speculation for the news media, which we'll probably be seeing they'll take up on their own. And very finally, folks, we do have a whole bunch of events coming up. Tomorrow, we have Nick Robbins, a very, very important fellow in the field of green finance, formerly of HSBC, now over at LSE, talking all about the road to net zero and obviously COP26 in November. But at this point, I really need to turn and thank our 3 panelists today. It was a real delight to have you with us and to share your thoughts. Unfortunately, in this age of lockdown, I am unable to open the floodgates of applause, but I have a highly advanced technical applausometer. This is my Korean karmic clapper, which is a substitute, I'm afraid. And we hope to learn a lot more from you in the years to come about some of the pitfalls here that we really do need to avoid. So thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you.
Lovely to be here.
Thanks very much. Pleasure.